The Whispering Pines Ranger Station sits 40 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but ancient forest and absolute silence. When Ranger Catherine Mills handed Maya the keys, her weathered hands trembled slightly as she whispered those final words, "Take care of this place." Maya thought it was just typical ranger devotion to the job. She was wrong, dead wrong. The ranger station was larger than she'd expected from the online listing, a sturdy log structure that looked like it had weathered decades of harsh winters. Catherine had built it herself, she'd mentioned, back in the 70s, when women rangers were still a novelty. The porch wrapped around 3 sides, and Maya could see why someone might fall in love with this place. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of Douglas fir and hemlock that seemed to swallow sound itself. She fumbled with the brass key, old-fashioned, heavy, and pushed open the front door. The hinges protested with a long groan that echoed through the interior. Inside, everything spoke of careful maintenance and decades of solitary living. Hand-hewn beams crossed the ceiling, and a stone fireplace dominated one wall. The furniture was simple but solid: a worn leather couch, a dining table scarred by years of use, bookshelves lined with field guides and scientific journals. Maya set her bag down and walked to the kitchen window. The view was breathtaking. Endless wilderness stretching to distant mountains. No cell towers, no power lines, no evidence that the 21st century had ever happened. Perfect for someone trying to forget their past. She'd been running for 6 months now, ever since her resignation from the CDC. Asking questions about Project Chimera had been a mistake, she realized now. Some stones were better left unturned, some files better left unopened. The official story was budget cuts, but Maya knew better. She'd gotten too close to something they didn't want exposed. Dinner was a simple affair, canned soup heated on the propane stove while rain began pattering against the windows. The weather matched her mood, grey, unsettled, carrying the promise of storms. She'd chosen this assignment specifically because it was temporary, just 3 weeks while Catherine visited her sister in Portland. 3 weeks to figure out what came next. As darkness fell, the forest seemed to press closer to the windows. Maya lit the oil lamps Catherine had shown her, backup lighting for when the generator was off. The warm glow pushed back the shadows but somehow made the silence more profound. She'd grown up in cities where silence meant something was wrong. Here, silence was supposed to be natural. She was reading one of Catherine's journals, detailed observations of wildlife patterns and weather data, when the first vibration came. It was so subtle she almost missed it, a tremor that traveled up through the floorboards into the soles of her feet. Maya froze, listening. The rain had intensified, drumming against the roof, but this was something else, something from below. Her scientific mind immediately began cataloging possibilities. Geological activity was common in this region. Underground streams could create vibrations. Settling wood expanded and contracted with temperature changes. All perfectly rational explanations. But none of them explained why the rhythm sounded so much like breathing. Maya stood slowly, her hands still tingling from contact with the floor. She retrieved a flashlight and walked the perimeter of the room, examining the baseboards. In the far corner, behind Catherine's desk, she found something odd, a section where the floorboards didn't quite meet the wall. The gap was narrow but definite. She knelt again, playing the flashlight beam into the space. Cool air drifted up from below, carrying a scent she couldn't identify. Something organic but wrong, like flowers left too long in water. The breathing sound came again, longer this time, and Maya felt her training kick in. After 5 years in biocontainment, she recognized the signs of something alive in places it shouldn't be. She just didn't know yet how very alive it was. The morning light filtered through the pines as Sarah Chen pulled her ranger truck up to the weathered log cabin. She'd made this drive 1,000 times over the past 8 years, but today felt different. Today was her last morning here for 3 months. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by towering Douglas firs that creaked and whispered in the mountain wind. It was the most isolated ranger station in the district, nearly 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that became impassable in heavy snow. Sarah had requested this posting specifically for its solitude. After the divorce, after the endless questions and pitying looks from colleagues, she'd needed this sanctuary. Now she was leaving it in the hands of a stranger. Sarah gathered her remaining personal items from the truck and climbed the familiar steps to the wraparound porch. The floorboards groaned under her boots, a sound that had initially unnerved her but had become as comforting as a lullaby. She'd need to remember to warn Emma about that. The woman had seemed jumpy during their video call last week. She walked through the main room one last time, her fingers trailing along the stone mantelpiece she'd rebuilt after last winter's ice damage. This place had saved her sanity. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was abandoning it now just as her life was finally coming back together. The promotion to the district office was everything she'd worked toward, but leaving felt like losing something essential. A rumble of tires on gravel announced Emma's arrival. Sarah stepped onto the porch as a dusty Honda Civic navigated the final turn. The car looked absurdly small against the massive trees, like a child's toy in a giant's garden. Emma Reeves emerged from the driver's seat, stretching her arms above her head. She was younger than Sarah had expected from their video call, maybe late 20s, with shoulder-length brown hair and the pale complexion of someone who spent too much time indoors. She wore jeans and a university sweatshirt, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone perpetually afraid of making mistakes. "You made good time," Sarah called out, walking down to meet her. "GPS lost signal about 10 miles back," Emma replied, offering a nervous smile. "I started to wonder if I'd taken a wrong turn into the Twilight Zone. That's just Tuesday morning up here. Cell service is practically theoretical." Sarah helped Emma wrestle an oversized suitcase from the Honda's back seat. "You packed like you're planning to stay a year." "Books, mostly. Research materials." Emma's eyes swept across the clearing, taking in the dense forest that pressed against the cabin from all sides. "It's so quiet." "You'll get used to it. The silence can be overwhelming at first, but most people find it peaceful after a few days." Sarah studied Emma's expression, noting the tension around her eyes. "You sure you're ready for this level of isolation? The nearest neighbor is 12 miles down the mountain." "That's exactly what I need." Something flickered across Emma's face, determination mixed with what looked like relief. "I have work to do, and I can't afford distractions." They spent the next hour going through Sarah's orientation checklist. She showed Emma how to start the generator when the power inevitably failed, explained the Radio S emergency channels, and demonstrated the proper way to bank the wood stove for overnight burns. Emma listened intently, taking notes in a small leather journal. "The foundation can be noisy," Sarah mentioned as they finished the tour in the bedroom. "Settling sounds, thermal expansion. Sometimes it almost sounds like something moving around down there, but it's just the old concrete shifting." Emma paused in her note-taking. "Foundation? The cabin sits on a concrete pad. Unusual for a structure this old, but it keeps the moisture out." Sarah tapped her boot against the floor. "Probably some kind of industrial foundation from before the land became part of the park system. There are old government survey markers scattered throughout this area." "What kind of government work?" "No idea. Probably forestry research or geological surveys. The records from that era are spotty." Sarah glanced at her watch. "I should get moving. Want to reach the highway before the afternoon storms roll in." They walked outside together, and Sarah loaded her remaining bags into the truck. The mountain air carried the scent of pine needles and the distant promise of rain. "You have my number for emergencies," Sarah said, climbing into the driver's seat. "But remember, if something serious happens, your first call should be to Park Dispatch on Channel 7. Emma nodded, clutching the radio Sarah had given her. She looked small standing there in the clearing, dwarfed by the towering trees and the vast wilderness stretching endlessly in all directions. As Sarah drove away, her rearview mirror showed Emma still standing motionless beside the cabin, as if she'd already begun the process of taking root. The basement had always been off-limits, but Maya had never bothered to ask why. Sarah's instructions had been clear. Stay out of the basement, don't mess with the generator unless absolutely necessary, and call the ranger station if anything seemed wrong. Simple enough for a month of house-sitting in exchange for free lodging and solitude to work on her dissertation. But the sounds had started 3 nights ago. At first, Maya attributed the low humming to the old cabins settling, or maybe the ancient plumbing. Mountain cabins made all sorts of noises, especially ones built in the 1960s like this one. The sound was barely perceptible, a deep thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards beneath her feet. She'd mentioned it during her last phone check-in with Sarah, who'd brushed it off as the water heater acting up. "Old place has its quirks," Sarah had said, her voice crackling through the spotty cell connection. "The basement's just storage anyway, nothing down there but cobwebs and my dad's old hunting gear." But tonight, the humming had changed. It pulsed now, rhythmic and deliberate, like a massive heartbeat buried deep in the earth. Maya stood in the kitchen, bare feet pressed against the cold linoleum, feeling the vibration travel up through her bones. Whatever was causing it, it wasn't the water heater. She'd been trying to ignore it, focusing instead on her research about soil contamination in former mining towns. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, studying environmental disasters while standing above what felt like the Earth's own troubled pulse. But concentration had become impossible. The sound seemed to call to her, demanding investigation. Maya grabbed the heavy flashlight from the kitchen drawer and approached the basement door. The wooden stairs creaked under her weight as she descended, the beam of light cutting through musty darkness that smelled of damp earth and something else. Something metallic and sharp that made her nose wrinkle. The humming was definitely coming from below. A metal grate covered the opening, secured with a padlock that looked far newer than anything else in the basement. Sarah's father's hunting gear was nowhere to be seen. Instead, Maya found something that made her blood run cold, a stack of manila folders, their edges yellowed with age, sitting on a workbench near the tunnel entrance. With trembling fingers, she opened the top folder. The pages inside were stamped with official seals and marked classified in red ink. Project Subterrane, dated 1962. Her eyes scanned the dense text, picking out phrases that made less and less sense the more she read. Induced hibernation protocols, nutritional suspension matrices, controlled awakening stimuli. For over 60 years. A new sound joined the humming, a scraping noise, like something large moving against stone. Maya's flashlight beam wavered as her hands shook. She flipped through more pages, finding architectural diagrams of an extensive underground complex, complete with laboratory spaces, containment units, and what looked like feeding systems. The scraping sound grew louder, more insistent. Dust began to sift down from the basement ceiling as the vibrations intensified. Whatever was down there was moving more than it had in decades. Maya stuffed the folders under her arm and backed toward the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. As she reached the first step, she heard something that made her freeze, a sound that was definitely not mechanical. It was organic, wet, and hungry, a feeding sound, like something large consuming something else with methodical efficiency. She ran. Back in the kitchen, Maya spread the files across the table with shaking hands. Her phone showed no signal, as usual. The landline was dead. She'd discovered that her first day, another of the cabin's quirks that Sarah had forgotten to mention. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and her car was at the bottom of the mountain getting repairs after hitting a pothole that had nearly swallowed her front wheel. The humming continued beneath her feet, but now she understood what she was hearing. Not machinery, but breathing. Slow, deep, and getting stronger. Something was waking up down there, and Maya was beginning to suspect that her presence in the cabin wasn't the coincidence she'd thought it was. "Sometimes these old places just get drafty," he'd said with a shrug before driving away, leaving Sarah to wonder why Eleanor had never mentioned the cabin's tendency to turn Arctic without warning. She stood at the kitchen window, nursing her third cup of coffee and watching the tree line. The forest pressed close to the cabin's walls, dense evergreens creating shadows even in the afternoon light. Something had been moving between those trees for the past hour. Not the quick darting of squirrels or the lumbering gait of a bear, but something else. Something that seemed to pause and watch the cabin with an intelligence that made her skin crawl. The radio crackled from the counter, Eleanor's voice cutting through the static. "Tower base to cabin 7. Do you copy?" Sarah grabbed the handset. "I'm here, Eleanor. Everything's quiet." "Good to hear. Listen, I'm going to be delayed another few days. There's been some unusual seismic activity in the northwest quadrant, and we need to assess potential trail damage before reopening that section." "Seismic activity?" Sarah glanced down at the floor. "Like earthquakes?" "Small tremors, nothing to worry about. The Geological Survey team thinks it might be related to old mining operations. This whole area is riddled with abandoned shafts and tunnels from the 1950s. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What kind of mining?" Static filled the line for several seconds. When Eleanor's voice returned, it sounded distant, distracted. "Government contract work, mostly. They were looking for uranium deposits during the Cold War. Found some things they weren't expecting, according to the old reports." "What kind of things?" "Sarah, you're breaking up. I'll check in tomorrow." The radio went silent, leaving Sarah alone with the growing shadows and the persistent cold that seemed to rise from beneath her feet. She tried calling back, but got only static in response. As evening approached, the temperature inside the cabin continued to drop despite the furnace running constantly. Sarah had pulled on her heaviest jacket and was considering starting a fire when she heard it, a sound that made her freeze with one hand on the fireplace poker. Scratching. Not the scratching of mice in the walls or branches against the roof, but something deliberate and rhythmic, coming from directly below the living room. She knelt on the hardwood floor, pressing her ear to the boards. The sound stopped immediately, as if whatever was making it had sensed her listening. Sarah remained motionless for several minutes, but the scratching didn't resume. When she finally stood, her knees were stiff from the cold radiating through the floor. She needed to find the source of the draft, and that meant checking the basement. The basement door stood slightly ajar, though she was certain she'd closed it that morning. The wooden steps creaked under her weight as she descended with a flashlight, the beam cutting through absolute darkness. The basement was smaller than she'd expected, mostly used for storage, old camping equipment, boxes of files, and a water heater that hummed quietly in the corner. But it was the far wall that caught her attention. What she'd assumed was solid foundation revealed itself as something else entirely under the flashlight's beam. A metal door, painted the same grey as the concrete walls, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. The paint was old and chipped, and stenciled letters were barely visible across its surface. Authorized personnel only. Project Hollow Earth. Sarah approached the door slowly. There was no handle on her side, just a smooth metal surface with what looked like an electronic lock, long since dead. But along the bottom edge, she could see that the seal had been broken. Something had pushed through from the other side, bending the heavy metal outward just enough to create a gap. The scratching sound resumed, much clearer now. It was coming from beyond the door, accompanied by something else, a rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against metal. As Sarah listened, more sounds joined the chorus. Multiple sources moving in the darkness beyond the barrier. Her flashlight beam caught something glistening near the door's base. She knelt for a closer look and immediately recoiled. Dark stains covered the concrete floor, still wet despite the basement's chill. They led from the damaged door to a drain in the center of the room, as if something had been feeding down here and cleaning up afterward. The tapping stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, Sarah became aware of another sound, breathing that wasn't her own, coming from the gap beneath the door. Slow, deliberate breaths, as if something large was testing the air on her side of the barrier. Sarah backed toward the stairs, her flashlight beam wavering. As she reached the first step, she heard movement beyond the door, not the scratching or tapping, but the sound of something heavy shifting position, followed by what might have been a whisper, or a sigh of anticipation. The basement door stood ajar when Maya returned from her morning walk, a thin sliver of darkness that made her stomach clench. She distinctly remembered closing it the night before, even checking the latch twice after hearing those strange sounds. The coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering against the kitchen tiles in a spray of ceramic and lukewarm liquid. She stared at the door, willing it to be her imagination, but the gap remained, perhaps 6 inches of impenetrable black that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. A low vibration thrummed through the floorboards beneath her feet, so subtle she almost missed it. The remaining dishes in the sink rattled softly, a barely perceptible tremor that raised goosebumps along her arms. Maya pressed her palm against the kitchen counter, feeling the vibration travel up through her bones. Something was definitely wrong. She grabbed her phone, thumb hovering over Kate's contact, but hesitated. What would she say? The doors were opening by themselves and the house was shaking. Kate would think she'd lost her mind, probably cut her assignment short and come racing back. Maya couldn't afford to lose this job, not when her savings account was already running on fumes. The vibration stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Maya crept toward the basement door, her bare feet silent on the hardwood. The gap seemed wider now, though she couldn't be sure. The darkness beyond was absolute, as if light itself refused to penetrate whatever lay below. She reached for the handle, then yanked her hand back. The metal was ice cold, far colder than it should have been in the mild autumn weather. Frost hadn't formed, but the temperature difference was shocking enough to make her fingertips ache. "Hello?" she called softly, feeling foolish even as the word left her lips. "Is someone down there?" Her voice seemed to be absorbed by the darkness, swallowed without even an echo. The silence that followed was oppressive, weighted with expectation. Maya forced herself to grip the handle, hissing at the cold, and pulled the door shut. The latch clicked into place with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet house. She turned the small lock beneath the handle, something she hadn't noticed before, and stepped back. The vibration returned immediately, stronger this time. The entire house seemed to shudder, and Maya heard a deep groaning sound from somewhere far below, like old metal straining against immense pressure. She stumbled as the floor bucked beneath her feet, catching herself against the kitchen island. Through the basement door came a sound that made her blood freeze, a rhythmic thumping, slow and deliberate, as if something large was striking the underside of the floor. The impacts followed a pattern, 3 heavy blows, a pause, then 3 more, over and over with mechanical precision. Maya backed toward the living room, her heart hammering against her ribs. The thumping grew louder, more insistent, and she realized with mounting horror that whatever was making the sound was moving. The impacts were traveling along the length of the house, following her footsteps from below. She broke into a run, bursting through the front door onto the covered porch. The cool morning air hit her face like a slap, and she gulped it down, trying to calm her racing pulse. Behind her, the house had gone quiet again. Maya fumbled with her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the number for the Whitmore Park Ranger Station. If Kate wasn't available, maybe someone else could explain what was happening. There had to be a logical explanation, old pipes maybe, or some kind of geological activity. The call went straight to voicemail. Maya tried Kate's personal number, but it rang endlessly before cutting to another voicemail box. She left a rambling message about strange noises and asked Kate to call her back as soon as possible. When she turned to look at the house, every window was dark and empty. From the outside it appeared perfectly normal, a quaint cabin nestled among the pines, exactly the peaceful retreat she'd been expecting. But Maya could feel something watching her from within, a presence that made her skin crawl with invisible insects. She couldn't go back inside. Not yet. Maya walked to her car and sat in the driver's seat, leaving the door open, engine off. From here she had a clear view of the house and a quick escape route if needed. The rational part of her mind insisted she was overreacting, that isolation and unfamiliar surroundings were making her paranoid. But the primal part of her brain, the part that had kept her ancestors alive in a dangerous world, was screaming at her to drive away and never look back. The basement windows were small and positioned high on the foundation, barely visible through the overgrown shrubs. But as Maya watched, she could swear she saw movement behind the glass, a shifting of shadows that had nothing to do with the swaying trees overhead. And it knew she was up here. The emergency radio crackled to life at 3:47 a.m., jolting Sarah from the first real sleep she'd managed in days. Static filled the cabin before a voice broke through, distant, distorted, but unmistakably human. "Anyone out there? Day 3. Supplies running low." Sarah fumbled for the radio in the darkness, her heart hammering. She'd been trying to reach the outside world for nearly a week with no success. The voice faded back into static before she could respond. "Hello? Hello, can you hear me?" She pressed the transmit button frantically, adjusting the frequency dial. "This is Sarah Chen at White Rock Station. Please respond." Nothing but the empty hiss of dead air. She spent the next hour cycling through frequencies, catching fragments of what sounded like the same transmission, always just out of reach, always cutting off before she could make contact. The voice seemed to be pleading, desperate, but she couldn't make out enough words to understand what was happening. When dawn finally broke, Sarah stepped outside to check the radio antenna Claire had rigged to the cabin's roof. The morning air felt different somehow, thicker, with an almost metallic taste that made her mouth water uncomfortably. The forest around the cabin stood unnaturally still, as if every living thing was holding its breath. The antenna appeared intact, but as she circled the cabin, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach clench. The ground near the foundation had shifted overnight. What had been a barely perceptible depression yesterday was now a noticeable dip, perhaps 6 inches deep and roughly circular, stretching about 10 feet across. The earth looked dark and rich, almost black, as if something had been feeding it from below. Sarah knelt at the edge of the depression, pressing her palm to the soil. It felt warm, too warm for early morning, and seemed to pulse gently beneath her touch like a slow heartbeat. She jerked her hand back, wiping it on her jeans, but the strange tingling sensation lingered in her fingertips. Back inside, she tried calling Claire's satellite phone again. Still no answer, but this time the phone didn't even ring, just a harsh, electronic tone that hurt her ears. She checked her own cell phone signal bars. Nothing. The landline was still dead. Around midday, while cataloguing the remaining food supplies, Sarah heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the mountain wilderness, heavy machinery, distant but distinct, like excavators or drilling equipment. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if she were surrounded by some massive construction project. She grabbed the binoculars and climbed onto the cabin's small deck, scanning the tree line. Nothing visible, but the mechanical rumbling continued, growing louder. The sound had an odd quality to it, almost organic, like the grinding of enormous teeth or the churning of a vast digestive system. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No birds, no wind through the trees, no insects buzzing. Just her own breathing and the thud of her pulse in her ears. That evening, Sarah discovered the basement. She'd been looking for the cabin's electrical panel when she noticed scratches in the wooden floor near the kitchen, long gouges that formed a rough rectangle. When she pressed down on one corner, a section of the floorboard lifted slightly. Hidden hinges. The trapdoor opened onto a set of concrete steps, descending into darkness. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying a smell that was both familiar and wrong, like a hospital mixed with something ancient and organic. Her flashlight beam revealed a small underground room with concrete walls and a single metal door at the far end. The room appeared to be some kind of monitoring station. Banks of old electronic equipment lined the walls, most of it dark and covered in dust, but several displays still glowed with a faint green light, showing readouts she couldn't interpret. Numbers that seemed to be climbing steadily. Graphs with jagged lines that spiked higher with each passing minute. A thick cable ran from the equipment through a hole in the concrete wall, disappearing into the earth beyond. Next to the hole, someone had painted a series of symbols in what looked like red paint, though the color had darkened with age to an unsettling brown. Sarah approached the metal door at the room's far end. No handle, just a magnetic card reader and a small window of reinforced glass. She pressed her face to the window, trying to see what lay beyond. The flashlight beam revealed a long corridor extending deeper underground, its walls lined with more cables and pipes. And something else, something that made her breath catch in her throat. The walls were moving, pulsing rhythmically, like the inside of some massive living thing. As she watched, transfixed and horrified, something shifted in the darkness at the far end of the corridor, something large and pale that seemed to sense her presence, turning slowly toward the door with movements that were fluid and entirely wrong. The basement felt different in the morning light filtering down through the cabin's floorboards above. Sarah had spent the night huddled on the couch, every creak and settling sound making her jump, but now curiosity overrode her fear. She needed answers, and the metal door behind the false wall seemed to mock her with its silence. The crowbar felt heavy in her hands as she descended the wooden steps again. The musty smell was stronger today, tinged with something chemical that made her nose burn. She'd found the crowbar in Ranger Chen's tool shed, along with a heavy-duty flashlight that cut through the basement's gloom like a sword. The concrete around the door's frame had cracked during the night. Sarah was certain it hadn't looked this damaged yesterday. Thin fissures spider-webbed outward from the seal, and when she pressed her palm against the metal surface, she could swear she felt a subtle vibration, like a massive heart beating somewhere far below. She wedged the crowbar into the gap where the door met its frame. The metal groaned in protest, but held firm. Sarah threw her weight behind the lever, muscles straining. Nothing. She adjusted her grip and tried again, this time focusing on a spot where the concrete had crumbled away entirely. With a screech that made her teeth ache, the door shifted. Just an inch, but it was progress. A whisper of air escaped through the gap, carrying with it a smell that made Sarah gag, decay mixed with antiseptic, like a hospital morgue left to rot. She worked at the door for another 20 minutes, prying and pulling until she'd opened it wide enough to squeeze through. The flashlight beam revealed a metal staircase descending into absolute darkness. The walls were lined with white tiles, many of them cracked or missing entirely. Water damage had left brown stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood in the harsh LED light. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, "Don't go down there." Her blood went cold. She spun around, expecting to see someone watching from the basement stairs, but she was alone. She tried calling the number back, but it went straight to a disconnected line message. Another text appeared. Project Lazarus was terminated for a reason. "Who is this?" She typed back, her fingers trembling. The response came immediately. Someone who was there. "GET out now." But Sarah couldn't leave, not when she was this close to understanding what was happening to her. The nightmares, the voices, the way the cabin seemed to pulse with malevolent life, it was all connected to whatever lay at the bottom of these stairs. She squeezed through the doorway and began her descent. The metal steps rang hollowly under her feet, the sound echoing strangely in the enclosed space. After 30 steps, she reached a landing with another door, this one standing slightly ajar. Beyond it, her flashlight revealed a long corridor lined with windows. Sarah pushed through the door and immediately wished she hadn't. The windows looked into laboratory rooms, each one containing equipment that belonged in a science fiction nightmare. Massive glass tanks filled with murky liquid lined the walls. Computer terminals with screens dark for decades sat beneath control panels studded with switches and dials. But it was the examination tables that made Sarah's stomach clench, metal gurneys with leather restraints, stained with substances she didn't want to identify. Her phone buzzed again. "It's waking up because you're there. Your presence is accelerating the process." "What process?" she typed, though part of her already knew she didn't want the answer. "Cellular regeneration. They tried to create the perfect predator, something that could hunt, kill, and heal from any wound. It worked too well. Sarah moved deeper into the facility, passing room after room of abandoned experiments. In one lab, she found filing cabinets with documents stamped classified in red letters. Most of the papers had been destroyed by moisture and time, but she could make out fragments. Subject 7 showed remarkable adaptation. Feeding requirements exceeded projections. Recommend immediate termination of project. A sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the facility, a wet, sliding noise like something massive moving through water. Sarah froze, her flashlight beam wavering as her hands shook. The sound came again, closer this time. Something was definitely moving down here, something that had been waiting in the dark for decades. Her phone's screen flashed with one final message: run, now, before it smells you. But as Sarah turned to flee, she realized she could hear something else over the wet, sliding sounds. A voice, barely human, calling her name from the depths of the facility. It knew she was here. It had been waiting for her specifically. And now that she'd opened the door, there was nowhere left to hide. The emergency broadcast crackled through Sarah's radio at 3:47 a.m., jolting her from the first real sleep she'd managed in days. Static filled the cabin as she fumbled for the volume, her heart already racing before she'd fully processed the words. Immediate evacuation of all residents within a 15-mile radius of Blackwood National Forest. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. All personnel are to report to designated safe zones immediately. Sarah's blood turned to ice water. 15 miles. The cabin sat dead center in that radius. She threw on clothes with shaking hands, her mind reeling. The tremors, the sounds from below, Marcus's terror. It was all connected to something bigger than she'd imagined, something that had triggered a government-wide evacuation order. Outside, the pre-dawn darkness seemed thicker than usual, pressing against the windows like a living thing. Sarah grabbed her emergency kit and headed for the door, but stopped when she heard it. A low, rhythmic thumping from beneath the floorboards, not the random scratching or scraping she'd grown accustomed to, but something deliberate, measured. Thump, 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 like a heartbeat. The radio squawked again. All Park Service personnel, be advised that Dr. Elena Vasquez is en route to your location. Do not, repeat, do not attempt to leave until you've made contact. Dr. Vasquez? Sarah had never heard the name, but something about it sent a chill down her spine. She reached for her truck keys, then froze as headlights swept across the cabin's front windows. A black SUV materialized from the darkness, moving fast down the narrow access road. The vehicle skidded to a halt in the gravel driveway, and a woman emerged, mid-50s, graying hair pulled back severely, wearing a government-issued jacket that looked like it had seen better decades. She moved with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to crisis situations. "Ranger Chen?" The woman's voice carried an authority that made Sarah's spine straighten involuntarily. "Dr. Elena Vasquez, Department of Energy. We need to talk." Department of Energy, not Fish and Wildlife, not the Forest Service. Sarah's mouth went dry. What's happening? The evacuation order is necessary. Dr. Vasquez stepped onto the porch, her eyes scanning the cabin's exterior with the practiced efficiency of someone conducting an inspection. "How long have you been experiencing seismic activity?" "Seismic?" Sarah's laugh came out hollow. "You mean the tremors? 3 days, maybe 4. But that's not. There are sounds. Something's down there." Dr. Vasquez's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "Show me." They entered the cabin together, and immediately the thumping from below intensified, as if responding to their presence. Dr. Vasquez pulled out a device Sarah didn't recognize, some kind of scanner that beeped softly as she moved it around the room. 60 feet down, Dr. Vasquez murmured, more to herself than to Sarah. "Right on schedule." "Schedule?" Sarah's voice rose. "What schedule? What's 60 feet down?" The older woman pocketed her device and fixed Sarah with a stare that seemed to weigh her soul. In 1987, the Department of Energy, in cooperation with several defense contractors, established a deep storage facility beneath this location. We were told it was for radioactive waste. We're told. The paperwork was classified above my clearance level at the time. I was a junior researcher, brought in to monitor environmental impact. But I saw things. Dr. Vasquez paused as another series of thumps echoed from below, stronger now. The containers they brought in weren't standard waste storage. They were biological containment units. Sarah felt the cabin floor vibrate beneath her feet. Biological containment for what? I never found out. The project was shut down abruptly in 1988. All personnel were reassigned, all records sealed. But before they closed it, they installed monitoring equipment throughout the facility. She gestured toward the floorboards. Motion sensors, temperature gauges, atmospheric analyzers, all connected to a central alert system. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity, the alert system that just triggered the evacuation. After 35 years of silence, Dr. Vasquez moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. Whatever they stored down there, it's been dormant, until now. A new sound joined the rhythmic thumping, a scraping, sliding noise that seemed to move in patterns beneath their feet. Sarah grabbed the radio as fresh static burst through. Dr. Vasquez, this is command. We're reading massive energy signatures from your location. What's your status? Dr. Vasquez took the radio with steady hands. The containment has been compromised. Repeat, containment is compromised. Initiate Protocol 7 immediately. Copy that. Evacuation teams are en route. Estimated arrival 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Sarah looked at the floor, where dust motes danced in the air from the vibrations below. Whatever was down there was getting stronger, more active. And they were sitting directly above it. Dr. Vasquez, she said quietly, what exactly is Protocol 7? The older woman's face had gone pale. Scorched earth, Ranger Chen. When containment fails, you sterilize the entire area. Outside, something howled in the distance, a sound no forest animal had ever made. The emergency radio crackled to life at 3:47 a.m., jolting Sarah from her restless sleep on the cabin's couch. She'd been dozing fitfully, every creak and whisper of wind making her jump since discovering the hidden laboratory beneath her temporary home. All units, we have reports of seismic activity in the Blackwood sector. Magnitude 4.2, epicenter approximately 2 miles northeast of Ranger Station 7. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Ranger Station 7 was Maya's designation for this very cabin. She grabbed the radio with trembling fingers. This is Sarah Chen, house-sitting at Station 7. I need to report something. Static filled the air for several heartbeats before a gruff voice responded. Ma'am, this is an emergency frequency. Unless you're reporting an immediate threat to life or property. There's something under the cabin, Sarah interrupted, her voice cracking. Some kind of underground facility, and I think something's moving down there. The silence stretched so long, she wondered if the connection had died. When the voice returned, it carried a different tone entirely, sharp, alert, almost fearful. Ma'am, I need you to state your exact location and remain where you are. Do not, under any circumstances, go outside or investigate any unusual sounds. Before Sarah could respond, the cabin shuddered violently. Not the rolling motion of an earthquake, but something more deliberate, more purposeful, as if something massive had shifted its weight far below. The lights flickered and died. In the sudden darkness, Sarah heard it clearly for the first time, a sound that made her skin crawl. Something was scratching against metal, slow and methodical, like claws testing the strength of a cage. The sound came from directly beneath the kitchen floor. She fumbled for her flashlight, its beam cutting through the blackness to reveal that the scratching had left visible marks. Thin gouges had appeared in the hardwood, as if whatever lurked below was strong enough to score the floor from underneath. The radio squawked again. Ma'am, are you there? We're dispatching a team to your location, but you need to listen carefully. Move to the highest point in the structure and stay away from the floor. Sarah's laugh came out as a strangled sob. The highest point? It's a one-story cabin. Then, get on the furniture. Do it now. The substance had an organic quality that made her stomach lurch. It pulsed with its own rhythm, and wherever it touched, the wood began to darken and warp. The acrid smell of decay filled the air, mixed with something chemical and wrong. "What is this thing?" she whispered into the radio. Static answered her. Then that same careful voice. Project Chimera was shut down in 1987. All subjects were supposed to have been terminated. Subjects. The word hit her like a physical blow. "Ma'am, I need you to understand. Whatever's down there has been contained for over 30 years. The recent seismic activity may have compromised the containment protocols." The floor beneath the kitchen table suddenly splintered, revealing a gaping hole from which more of the dark substance poured. But this time, Sarah could see that it wasn't just liquid. There were shapes within it, pale, writhing forms that might have once been recognizable as something human. She bit back a scream as one of the shapes pressed against the hole's edge, revealing what looked like a face stretched beyond all recognition. Multiple eyes blinked at her from impossible angles, and when it opened what might have been a mouth, she saw rows of needle-sharp teeth. "It's coming up," she whispered into the radio. "Oh God, it's coming up right now." The creature, because she could no longer pretend it was anything else, began pulling itself through the hole with appendages that shifted between arms, tentacles, and things that defied description. Its body seemed to be composed of that same dark substance, constantly flowing and reforming. Behind it, more shapes pressed upward, eager to follow. The radio crackled urgently. "Ma'am, the team is 15 minutes out. You need to get to higher ground immediately." "There is no higher ground," Sarah screamed as the first creature fully emerged, its impossible anatomy allowing it to move in ways that hurt to watch. It turned what passed for its head toward her, and in that moment of eye contact, Sarah felt something crawl through her mind. Images flashed. Underground chambers filled with failed experiments, scientists in hazmat suits taking notes as things that had once been human begged for death, and somewhere in the darkness, a voice that promised endless hunger finally satisfied. The creature smiled with too many mouths and took its first step toward her improvised refuge. The emergency radio crackled to life at 3:47 a.m., jolting Sarah from her restless sleep. Static filled the cabin, then a voice, distorted, barely human, whispered her name through the white noise. She bolted upright, heart hammering against her ribs as she stared at the device across the room. The voice came again, clearer this time, and unmistakably familiar. "Sarah, help me." It was Elena's voice, but wrong somehow. Stretched thin like taffy, with an underlying resonance that made Sarah's teeth ache. She stumbled across the cold floor, her bare feet slapping against the wood as she reached for the radio with trembling fingers. "Elena? Elena, is that you? Where are you?" The response was immediate, flooding the cabin with that distorted voice. "Below, so cold down here. They're waking up, Sarah. God, they're all waking up." The transmission cut to static, then silence. Sarah frantically adjusted the dials, calling Elena's name into the void, but only dead air answered back. Outside, the wind had died completely, leaving the forest in an unnatural stillness that pressed against the windows like a living thing. She dressed quickly, her hands shaking as she pulled on boots and grabbed her flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness as she stepped onto the porch, illuminating the familiar path that now seemed alien and threatening. Every shadow could hide something watching, waiting. The very air felt thick, charged with an electric tension that made her skin crawl. 20 yards from the cabin, she found the hole. It hadn't been there yesterday. She was certain of that. The earth had split open like a wound, creating a jagged cavity roughly 6 feet across. Her flashlight beam disappeared into the depths without finding a bottom. The edges were too clean, too precise, as if something had pushed up from below with tremendous force. A smell rose from the opening. Decay mixed with something metallic and sharp, like copper pennies left in the rain. Sarah covered her nose with her sleeve and stepped closer, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to run. At the rim she could see strange markings carved into the exposed earth, not natural formations, but deliberate symbols that hurt to look at directly. "Elena?" she called down into the darkness. Her voice echoed strangely, seeming to stretch and distort as it descended. "Are you down there?" Something moved in the depths. Not Elena. The movement was too fluid, too wrong. Sarah stumbled backward as a sound drifted up from below, a wet, sliding noise like meat being dragged across stone. Her flashlight flickered, the beam wavering as if the darkness itself was fighting against the light. The radio in her pocket suddenly erupted with noise, not static this time, but voices, dozens of them, all speaking at once in languages she didn't recognize. Some sounded human, others decidedly not. They rose and fell in a chaotic symphony that seemed to follow no earthly rhythm. Then Elena's voice cut through the cacophony, crystal clear. "Don't trust what you see, Sarah. They can wear our faces now. They've been learning." The transmission died, leaving Sarah alone in the suffocating silence. She backed away from the hole, her light sweeping frantically across the tree line. Every shadow seemed to shift and writhe at the edge of her vision. The familiar forest had become a maze of potential threats, each tree a hiding place for something that shouldn't exist. A branch snapped behind her. She spun around, the flashlight beam revealing a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. Sarah's relief was immediate and overwhelming. Elena stood there, perfectly normal, wearing her ranger uniform and carrying her equipment pack. "Thank God," Sarah breathed, rushing toward her friend. "I heard you on the radio. What happened? Where have you been?" Elena smiled, but something was wrong with her expression. Too wide, too knowing. Her eyes reflected the flashlight beam like an animal's, and when she spoke, her voice carried that same strange resonance from the radio. "I've been below," Elena said, taking a step closer, "learning such interesting things. Did you know this place has been waiting for us? All these years, just waiting for the right moment to wake up and feed." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She backed away, raising the flashlight like a weapon. "You're not Elena." The thing wearing her friend's face laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, but I am. I'm Elena, and I'm also something much older, much hungrier." "The experiment never ended, Sarah. It just went underground, literally." The creature that looked like Elena began to change, its features shifting and flowing like wet clay. Sarah turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush as inhuman sounds erupted behind her. The cabin seemed impossibly far away, and with each step she could feel something vast and ancient stirring beneath her feet, finally awakened after decades of patient sleep. The emergency beacon's red light pulsed like a dying heartbeat in the growing darkness. Sarah's fingers trembled as she adjusted the frequency, desperately searching for any sign of rescue through the static. Behind her, Maya pressed bandages against the gash on her arm, wincing as the fabric darkened with blood. "How long before someone responds?" Maya asked, her voice barely audible over the wind that had begun to howl through the trees surrounding the cabin. "Could be hours, maybe longer with this storm coming in." Sarah glanced at the windows, where lightning illuminated the churning clouds. "We need to secure this place. Whatever's down there, it's not done with us." As if summoned by her words, a low rumble shook the floorboards beneath their feet. The coffee mug on the kitchen counter rattled against its saucer, and somewhere in the walls pipes groaned like something massive was shifting below. Maya stood unsteadily, favoring her injured leg. The journal mentioned feeding cycles. What if this is just the beginning? Sarah had been thinking the same thing. Dr. Hendrick's notes described the entity's awakening as gradual, building to what he called consumption events. The attacks they'd survived felt almost exploratory, like a predator testing its prey before the real hunt began. Another tremor, stronger this time. A framed photograph fell from the mantel, glass shattering across the hearth. The cabin's lights flickered, and for a terrifying moment, Sarah thought they might lose power entirely. But the generator hummed back to life, casting wavering shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. "We need weapons," Sarah said, moving toward the kitchen. She pulled open drawers, finding only butter knives and a rusty can opener. "There has to be something useful here." Maya limped to the fireplace and hefted the iron poker. Its weight was reassuring, the metal cold and solid in her grip. "What about the shed outside? Rangers usually keep tools, maybe an axe." The idea of leaving the cabin made Sarah's stomach clench, but Maya was right. They needed better defenses than kitchen utensils and fireplace tools. Through the window, she could see the small storage shed about 30 yards away, its outline barely visible in the storm's gathering fury. "We go together," Sarah decided. "Fast and quiet." "It's draining the power," Maya whispered. "Whatever's happening down there, it's pulling energy from everything." The floorboards in the center of the room began to bow upward, wood groaning under immense pressure from below. Sarah grabbed Maya's hand and pulled her toward the back door, but stopped when she heard something that made her blood freeze. Scratching. Not the random scraping they'd heard before, but deliberate, rhythmic, like claws or talons working methodically at the wooden foundation, following a pattern. Testing for weak points. "The basement," Maya breathed. "There's no basement in this cabin, but the journal mentioned underground chambers. What if the experiments weren't just conducted nearby? What if they were directly underneath?" Sarah's mind raced through the implications. If the entity had been contained below the cabin itself, then they weren't just witnesses to its awakening, they were sitting on top of its prison. And prisons, once breached, left prisoners very angry. "Move. Now." Sarah yanked the back door open and they stumbled into the night. Rain lashed their faces, and the wind threatened to knock them off their feet, but the storm felt like salvation compared to the malevolent presence awakening beneath the cabin. Behind them, windows exploded outward in sequence, glass fragmenting into the darkness. The emergency lighting failed completely, leaving only the intermittent lightning to illuminate their desperate sprint toward the shed. Maya's injured leg gave out halfway there, sending her sprawling into the mud. Sarah hauled her upright just as a new sound erupted from the cabin, a roar that seemed to come from the earth itself, deep and hungry and utterly inhuman. The shed door was locked, but Sarah kicked it until the hinges gave way. Inside, her hands found what they needed, a fire axe, heavy and sharp. She also grabbed a coil of rope and a battery-powered lantern that flickered to life with merciful white light. When they turned back toward the cabin, they saw that the entire structure had shifted, tilting at an unnatural angle as if the ground beneath it was collapsing. Red light pulsed from the broken windows, and in that crimson glow, something was rising. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as Maya dragged herself down the corridor, her shoulders screaming with each movement. Behind her, the thing that had once been Dr. Hendricks let out another wet, keening wail that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. The sound was wrong on every level, part human agony, part something else entirely. Sarah's hand found hers in the crimson darkness. "This way," she whispered, pulling Maya toward what looked like a maintenance shaft. "I saw it on the schematics." They squeezed through the narrow opening just as something massive slammed into the wall behind them. The impact sent a shower of dust and debris raining down, and Maya could hear the metal groaning under the assault. Whatever Hendricks had become, it was strong enough to tear through steel. The shaft was barely wide enough for one person, forcing them to crawl single file through suffocating darkness. Maya's injured shoulder made every movement agony, but the sounds of pursuit drove her forward. Something was following them through the ventilation system. She could hear it scraping and sliding, moving with unnatural fluidity through spaces that should have been impossible to navigate. "There," Sarah gasped, pointing ahead to where dim light leaked through a grate. "Emergency exit." They kicked out the grate and tumbled into another corridor, this one mercifully empty. But the silence felt worse somehow. pregnant with the promise of horrors yet to come. The air here was thick and humid, carrying a sweet, cloying scent that made Maya's stomach turn. Sarah consulted the torn schematic she'd grabbed from Hendrik's office. "We're close to the main lab now. If there's a way to stop this, it'll be there." They moved carefully down the hallway, passing doors marked with biohazard symbols and clearance levels Maya had never heard of. Through reinforced glass windows, she caught glimpses of empty laboratories filled with equipment she couldn't identify. In one room, something had clearly gone very wrong. The walls were covered in what looked like black veins, pulsing faintly in the emergency lighting. "Jesus Christ," Sarah breathed, stopping at a massive steel door marked Containment Level Alpha. "This is it. This is where they kept it." The door hung open, its electronic locks long since failed. Beyond lay a chamber that defied comprehension. The walls, floor, and ceiling were covered in the same black veining they'd seen elsewhere, but here it was thick as tree roots, creating an organic network that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. In the center of the room sat what had once been a containment unit, a cube of reinforced glass and steel that now lay shattered, its contents long since escaped. "They called it the Devourer," Sarah read from a placard near the entrance. "First contact established 1952. Specimens recovered from Siberian permafrost. Project Terminus launched 1953. Maya felt ice in her veins. Specimens? Plural? Before Sarah could answer, the lights went out completely. Emergency power had finally failed, plunging them into absolute darkness. Maya heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath, then a sound that made her blood freeze. The wet, sliding noise they'd been hearing in the vents, but louder now, much louder. "Sarah?" Maya whispered. A light flicked on, Sarah's phone flashlight, casting wild shadows around the corrupted chamber. But Sarah wasn't holding the phone. Something else was, something that wore Sarah's face, but had too many joints in its arms and fingers that bent in impossible directions. "Run," it said in Sarah's voice, but wrong somehow, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "You should run now." Maya didn't need to be told twice. She bolted from the chamber as the thing that looked like Sarah began to laugh, a sound like breaking glass mixed with a child's giggle. Behind her, she heard wet, tearing noises and what sounded like bones snapping and reforming. The corridors had become a maze of nightmare. The black veining covered everything now, and in some places it moved when she looked at it directly, reaching toward her with grasping tendrils. Doors stood open that she was certain had been closed before, revealing rooms full of shadows that seemed too deep for the space they occupied. She found a stairwell and climbed, desperate to reach the surface. Her shoulder throbbed with each step, and exhaustion made her legs feel like lead. But she could hear things following her, multiple things now, moving with purpose through the facility below. The Devourer wasn't just one creature, she realized. It was a hive mind, and it was learning, adapting, using the forms of its victims to hunt more efficiently. The stairwell emerged into what looked like a bunker entrance. Through a small window, Maya could see blessed daylight filtering down from above. She was almost to the surface, almost free. That's when she heard Sarah's voice again, echoing up from the depths below. "Maya? Maya, where are you? I found the kill switch. We can stop this." The voice was perfect, exactly right. And that's how Maya knew it was lying. The emergency generator's hum filled the basement as Sarah descended the concrete steps, her flashlight beam cutting through the stale air. The power had been out for 3 hours now, and something told her the outage wasn't coincidental. Behind her, Maya's footsteps echoed, uneven and hesitant. "Are you sure about this?" Maya whispered, her voice barely audible over the mechanical droning. Sarah didn't answer immediately. The truth was she wasn't sure about anything anymore. The files they'd discovered painted a picture so horrifying that part of her wanted to pretend she'd never seen them. Project Lazarus, human experimentation, something called the Hunger Protocol. But the scratching sounds from below had grown louder, more insistent, and she knew they were running out of time. The basement stretched further than she remembered. extending beyond the cabin's footprint into what must have been additional excavation. Their flashlight beams revealed concrete walls marked with government serial numbers and warning symbols that made her stomach clench. This wasn't just a cabin, it had been built as a monitoring station. "Look at this!" Maya called softly, her light illuminating a heavy steel door set into the far wall. A small window, reinforced with wire mesh, offered a view into darkness beyond. Warning labels in faded red lettering covered the door's surface, but the words that caught Sarah's attention were handwritten in what looked like dried blood. "God forgive us." The scratching stopped. In the sudden silence, Sarah could hear her heart hammering against her ribs. She approached the door slowly, each step deliberate. The concrete floor beneath her feet felt wrong somehow, as if it were vibrating with some deep, barely perceptible rhythm. Maya grabbed her arm. "Don't look through the window." But Sarah was already there, pressing her face to the reinforced glass. Her breath fogged the surface as she peered into the chamber beyond. At first she saw nothing but darkness. Then her flashlight beam found the far wall, and she had to grip the door frame to keep from falling. The chamber was enormous, carved directly from the bedrock, and it wasn't empty. What had once been human forms hung suspended from the ceiling by cables and tubes, dozens of them arranged in concentric circles around a central pit. Their bodies were wrong, elongated, twisted, covered in what looked like a second skin that pulsed with its own rhythm. Some still moved, twitching and writhing in their suspended animation. Others hung motionless, but even those seemed to track movement with eyeless sockets. "They're still alive," Sarah breathed. Maya pulled her back from the window. "We need to leave, now." But as they turned toward the stairs, the emergency generator coughed and died. The basement plunged into absolute darkness, broken only by their flashlight beams. In the silence that followed, they heard something that made both women freeze. Breathing, deep, labored breaths coming from behind the steel door. Then, impossibly, a voice, raspy and unused but unmistakably human. "Help us." Sarah's flashlight beam wavered as her hands began to shake. The voice came again, clearer now, joined by others, a chorus of whispers seeping through the steel barrier, pleading and desperate. "Please, so hungry, so long." Maya was already backing toward the stairs, but Sarah remained transfixed. The files had mentioned test subjects, volunteers who'd signed up for what they thought were standard medical trials. Young people, mostly. College students and military personnel who'd needed the money and asked no questions. "Sarah, we have to go," Maya hissed. The whispering intensified, becoming a low chant. The words were indistinct, but the meaning was clear. They knew someone was there. They knew fresh blood was close. Sarah finally turned to follow Maya, but stopped when her flashlight illuminated something new. A control panel beside the door, its surface covered in switches and dials. One switch was different from the others, larger, painted bright red, with a clear protective cover flipped open. A label beneath it read, "Emergency Containment Release." "Someone opened it," she said, her voice hollow with realization. "The containment has been compromised." The scratching resumed, but now it was coming from multiple directions, above them, around them, the sound of claws, or what had once been fingernails, scraping against concrete and metal. Maya grabbed Sarah's hand. "Run." They stumbled up the stairs in darkness, their flashlights creating a disorienting dance of shadows. Behind them, the scratching grew frantic, accompanied by a sound that chilled Sarah's blood, the grinding of metal under enormous pressure. They burst through the basement door into the cabin's main room, just as the first explosion echoed from below. The floorboards bucked beneath their feet, and dust rained from the ceiling. "The car," Maya gasped. "We have to get to the car." But as they reached for the front door, Sarah realized with crystalline clarity that they weren't going anywhere. Through the window, illuminated by pale moonlight, dark shapes moved between the trees, dozens of them, surrounding the cabin. The experiments hadn't just awakened, they had escaped. The service tunnel stretched endlessly into darkness, its concrete walls weeping with decades of accumulated moisture. Sarah's flashlight beam danced across rusted pipes and electrical conduits as she forced herself to move forward, each step echoing in the suffocating space. Behind her, the sounds of destruction continued, metal shrieking, concrete crumbling, and underneath it all, that horrible wet sliding noise that made her skin crawl. The folder clutched in her trembling hand contained fragments of truth, but she needed more. Dr. Morrison's final notes had mentioned a central control room, something about emergency protocols. If there was any way to stop what they'd unleashed, it would be there. A junction appeared ahead, 3 tunnels branching off in different directions. Sarah paused, trying to orient herself. The main facility would be deeper, toward the mountain's heart. She chose the middle passage, her instinct screaming that she was moving further from safety with each step. Her radio crackled to life, startling her so badly she nearly dropped the flashlight. "Sarah, Sarah, if you can hear this." Elena's voice was barely audible through the static. "I'm in the woods. The cabin. God, Sarah, the cabin's gone. There's just a hole where it used to be. The whole foundation collapsed into something underneath." Sarah pressed the radio close to her mouth. "Elena? Elena, I'm below ground. There's a government facility under your property. Something went wrong here decades ago and it's active again." The trees, Elena's voice cut through, panicked. "They're moving, Sarah. Not swaying, moving, like they're being pulled toward the hole, and there are sounds coming from down there, clicking and screaming." The transmission dissolved into static. Sarah tried to respond, but only white noise answered. She was alone again in the suffocating tunnel. A new sound reached her ears, machinery humming to life somewhere ahead. The emergency lighting stabilized, casting steady red pools along her path. Whatever was happening, the facility was awakening after its long dormancy. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber that stole her breath. The space was enormous, easily 3 stories high, filled with banks of computers and monitoring equipment that stretched into the shadows. Most surprising of all, some of it was still running. Banks of monitors displayed scrolling data, vital signs, containment readings, all pulsing with malevolent life. At the chamber's center stood a cylindrical tank, 20 feet high, constructed of thick glass or transparent aluminum. It had been cracked open like an egg, its contents long since escaped. Nutrient fluid pooled on the floor around its base, and the metallic smell of copper mixed with something far worse. Sarah approached one of the active workstations, her hands shaking as she accessed the files. The screens showed real-time biometric data, but the readings were impossible. Tissue samples that were simultaneously dead and alive, cellular structures that defied classification, growth rates that should have been lethal. A folder labeled Specimen 7, Final Phase, caught her attention. She clicked it open, and security footage began playing across multiple monitors. The timestamp read 3 weeks ago. She watched in horror as scientists in hazmat suits moved frantically around the facility. One monitor showed seismic readings spiking dramatically. Another displayed the specimen tank, still intact but with something massive moving inside the murky fluid. The scientists were clearly preparing for evacuation, downloading files, shutting down non-essential systems. Then the ground began to shake. The specimen tank cracked. Fluid gushed out in torrents, and something vast and impossible began to emerge. The camera angles made it difficult to see clearly, but Sarah caught glimpses of flesh that seemed to shift and flow, appendages that branched and merged, and worst of all, clusters of what looked like human faces embedded in the writhing mass. The evacuation became a rout. Scientists fled as emergency alarms blared. The last footage showed the creature expanding rapidly, filling the chamber, pressing against the walls and ceiling. Then the cameras went dark. Sarah realized she was looking at the aftermath. The thing had grown too large for even this massive space. It had burrowed upward, seeking room to expand, seeking food to sustain its impossible existence. The cabin site was directly above, The perfect emergence point. A new message appeared on the central monitor: containment breach. Authorization required for scorched earth protocol. Sarah's blood ran cold. A cursor blinked next to an input field, waiting for someone to make the choice. She understood with crystalline clarity that she was looking at a nuclear failsafe, a last resort to prevent the specimen from reaching the surface. But she was too late. It was already above ground, already free. Behind her, something began to move in the darkness beyond the chamber. The emergency broadcast crackled through Maya's radio as she pressed her back against the concrete wall of the underground facility. Static punctuated every other word, but the message was clear enough: mandatory evacuation of a 50-mile radius around Blackwood National Park. Military containment protocols were now in effect. Too late for that, she whispered to herself, watching the pulsing red emergency lights cast dancing shadows down the corridor ahead. The thing that had once been Sarah moved somewhere in the darkness beyond, its footsteps no longer quite human. Maya had watched in horror as her friend's body had begun to change after direct contact with the entity below. The transformation was gradual but relentless. Elongated limbs, joints that bent in impossible directions, and worst of all, Sarah's voice calling out to her with increasing desperation, even as her humanity slipped away. Maya clutched the emergency axe she'd taken from the wall station, though she doubted it would do much good against what Sarah was becoming. The classified files scattered around the abandoned laboratory had painted a terrifying picture. Project Lazarus hadn't been trying to create a weapon. They'd been trying to contain something they'd accidentally awakened during deep earth drilling operations in 1987. The entity fed on living tissue, but not in any conventional sense. It consumed the very essence of life itself, leaving behind hollow shells that it could animate and control. The research team had managed to put it into a kind of hibernation using electromagnetic fields, but the power grid's failure had removed those constraints. A wet sliding sound echoed from somewhere behind her. Maya forced herself to move forward, deeper into the facility. According to the emergency protocol she'd found, there was a manual override system that could reactivate the containment field, but it required 2 people to operate simultaneously. She was hoping against hope that some member of the original research team was still alive down here, though the blood trails and abandoned equipment suggested otherwise. The corridor opened into a vast chamber carved directly from the living rock. Emergency lighting strips along the floor created pools of red illumination that barely penetrated the oppressive darkness. In the center of the space, a massive drilling platform extended down into what appeared to be a bottomless pit. The metal framework was twisted and bent as if something enormous had tried to climb up through it. Maya's breath caught as she spotted movement along the walls. Dark, organic-looking tendrils snaked up from the pit, pulsing with a faint bioluminescent glow. They seemed to be searching, questing along the rock face like enormous nerve endings seeking stimulation. The override station was positioned on a raised platform overlooking the pit. Maya could see 2 sets of controls, one on each side, just as the protocols had indicated. But reaching them would mean crossing directly over the source of the contamination. "I can smell you, Maya." Sarah's voice was definitely coming from multiple sources now, echoing from different points around the chamber. "I can smell your fear. It's delicious." Maya took a deep breath and sprinted toward the platform. The tendrils immediately reacted to her movement, whipping through the air with surprising speed. One brushed against her shoulder, and she felt a numbing cold spread through her jacket. Where it touched, the fabric began to dissolve. "You can't stop it, Maya." The voice was closer now, and when Maya looked up, she saw Sarah, or what had been Sarah, climbing onto the platform. Her limbs were grotesquely elongated, and her fingers had become sharp, flexible appendages that gripped the metal railings like tentacles. "It's been alone for so long. It just wants to connect, to share itself with everything." Maya's mind raced. She needed someone at the second control station, but Sarah was the only other person here, and she was clearly no longer herself. The creature wearing her friend's face moved closer. its black eyes reflecting the emergency lights like oil. Then Maya remembered the timer function she'd seen mentioned in the protocols. If she could set a delay on one station, she might be able to reach the other in time. Her fingers flew over the controls as Sarah's transformed body lunged toward her with inhuman speed. "Base camp, this is Delta 7. A panicked voice broke through the interference. "We've lost contact with the containment team. Repeat, containment has been breached. The specimens are—" The transmission cut to white noise, then silence. Maya's breathing came in ragged gasps as they stumbled forward in the darkness, guided only by Sarah's flashlight and the faint emergency lighting that flickered sporadically along the tunnel walls. The concrete beneath their feet was slick with moisture and something else, something that smelled of copper and decay. "How much further?" Maya whispered, her voice barely audible above their footsteps. Sarah consulted the facility map she'd torn from the wall. "There should be an access shaft about 50 meters ahead. It leads up to the old ranger station near the lake." A thunderous crash echoed behind them, followed by the sound of concrete crumbling. Whatever had been contained in the laboratory was no longer content to stay put. The experiments Dr. Kovac had documented in his files, the ones that had been deemed too dangerous to continue, were finally free. Maya stumbled, her hand pressing against the tunnel wall for support. When she pulled it away, her palm came back black with what looked like oil, but moved with an unsettling fluidity across her skin. "Sarah," she said, her voice tight with fear. Sarah turned back, saw Maya's contaminated hand, and immediately grabbed her emergency chemical wash packet from a wall-mounted kit. "Don't touch anything else," she ordered, squeezing the solution over Maya's palm. The black substance hissed and bubbled before dissolving away. "What the hell was that?" "Something that should have stayed buried," Sarah replied grimly. She'd seen similar markings in the laboratory, dark stains that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, as if alive. They reached the access shaft, a vertical tube barely wide enough for one person. Rusted ladder rungs disappeared upward into darkness. Sarah tested the first rung. It held, but just barely. "You go first," she told Maya. "I'll cover our trail." Sarah had been wondering the same thing. The files suggested the experiments had been designed for adaptability, for survival in any environment. Decades of dormancy might have only made them stronger, more desperate. "Then we deal with it when we get there," Sarah said, checking her ammunition. 3 rounds left in her service weapon, hardly enough to stop whatever they'd witnessed in the lab. Maya began climbing, her movements quick but careful. The ladder groaned under her weight, and flakes of rust rained down with each step. Sarah followed, pulling the emergency radio close to her mouth. "This is Park Ranger Sarah Chen, badge number 4471. She broadcast on all frequencies. We have a code Black Emergency at coordinates 47.6062 north, 121.3321 west. Repeat, code Black. Requesting immediate evacuation and hazmat response." Static answered her. 20 feet up, Maya called down softly. "There's light ahead, natural light." Sarah felt a surge of relief mixed with apprehension. Daylight meant escape, but it also meant exposing whatever was down here to the world above. As they climbed higher, she could hear something else, a low humming that seemed to vibrate through the ladder itself. They emerged into a small concrete structure, half hidden by decades of overgrowth. Through the grimy windows, Sarah could see the lake in the distance, its surface mirror still in the afternoon sun. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. But the humming was stronger here, and Maya pointed to a series of vents built into the structure's walls. "It's coming from those." Sarah approached one of the vents cautiously. The metal grating was warm to the touch, and the humming intensified when she got close. Through the slats, she could see movement, something flowing like liquid mercury, but with an organic quality that made her stomach turn. "It's not just in the lab anymore," she realized. "It's in the ventilation system, the whole network." Maya checked her phone. Still no signal, but the GPS showed their location clearly. They were less than 2 miles from the main highway, but between them and civilization lay the entire park infrastructure. Every building, every facility, every place someone might seek shelter. "We have to warn people," Maya said. "Get to town. Call the authorities." Sarah nodded, but as they prepared to leave the structure, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt outside and footprints leading toward the lake. Someone else had been here recently, someone who might not know what they were walking into. The humming grew louder, and somewhere in the distance they heard the first scream. The creature's screams echoed through the underground facility as Maya dragged herself across the concrete floor, her leg throbbing with each movement. Behind her, Sarah was frantically working at the control panel, her fingers flying over switches and dials that hadn't been touched in decades. "The containment field is failing," Sarah shouted over the mechanical groaning that filled the air. Red warning lights bathed everything in an ominous glow, and somewhere in the depths below them, something massive was stirring. Maya pressed her back against the wall, clutching the emergency radio she'd managed to grab from the security station. Static filled the air as she tried to reach the outside world, but the signal was weak this far underground. "Come on," she whispered, adjusting the frequency. The floor beneath them shuddered violently, and chunks of concrete rained down from the ceiling. Through the reinforced glass windows that looked into the lower chambers, Maya could see movement, dark, writhing shapes that defied comprehension. The thing they'd awakened was no longer content to remain dormant. "Sarah, whatever you're doing, do it faster," Maya called out, wincing as she tried to put weight on her injured leg. "I'm trying to activate the emergency protocols, but half these systems are corrupted." Sarah's voice cracked with panic. "The files Dr. Morrison left. They mentioned something called a final solution, but I can't find the activation sequence." Another violent tremor shook the facility, and this time the lights flickered and went out completely. Emergency power kicked in a moment later, casting everything in an eerie red glow. In that brief moment of darkness, Maya could have sworn she saw something moving in the shadows at the edge of her vision. The radio crackled to life suddenly, a voice breaking through the static. "This is Ranger Station Alpha. Maya, is that you? We've been trying to reach you for hours." Maya grabbed the radio with both hands. "Tom, thank God. Listen to me carefully. You need to evacuate everyone within a 50-mile radius of Eagle's Rest Trail. Do it now." "What?" "Maya, what's happening out there?" "The seismic readings are off the charts." Before Maya could respond, a new sound filled the air, a low, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was like a heartbeat, but impossibly large and ancient. The sound made her teeth ache and her vision blur. "Sarah!" she called out, but when she turned toward the control panel, Sarah was standing perfectly still, her hands frozen over the switches. Her eyes had rolled back, showing only whites, and her mouth was moving silently. Maya dragged herself toward her friend, reaching out to shake her shoulder. The moment she made contact, images flooded her mind. Visions of the facility in its heyday, scientists in hazmat suits working with something that writhed and pulsed in a massive containment chamber. She saw Dr. Morrison, younger, but with the same haunted expression, arguing with military officials about the dangers of the project. And she saw what lay beneath them now, something that had once been human but had been changed, transformed by decades of experimentation into something else entirely, something that fed on consciousness itself, growing stronger with each mind it touched. "The neural interface," Sarah whispered suddenly, her voice hollow and distant. "It's trying to connect with us, to make us part of it." Maya jerked her hand away, and Sarah collapsed to her knees, gasping. The pulsing sound grew louder, and now they could hear something else, footsteps in the corridor outside the control room. Slow, deliberate footsteps that shouldn't exist this far underground. "The emergency protocols," Maya said urgently, helping Sarah to her feet. "You said there was a final solution?" Sarah nodded weakly, pointing to a red panel set apart from the other controls. "Thermal charges. They built them into the foundation. It would bring down the entire facility, seal everything permanently." She looked at Maya with hollow eyes. But we'd never make it out in time. The footsteps in the corridor stopped directly outside their door. Maya could see a shadow moving beneath the gap at the bottom of the door, but it wasn't the right shape, too fluid, too organic. How long do we have once you activate it? Maya asked, moving toward the red panel. Maybe 10 minutes. The charges are designed to create a controlled collapse, starting from the bottom levels. Maya looked at the radio in her hand, then at the control panel. Tom, she said into the radio, I need you to send every available unit to these coordinates and contact the CDC. Tell them we have a potential biological hazard that requires immediate containment. The shadow under the door was spreading now, seeping into the room like liquid darkness. Where it touched the floor, the concrete began to bubble and dissolve. Maya, Sarah whispered, we have to decide now. Maya's hand hovered over the emergency activation switch, her heart pounding as the darkness crept closer to their feet. The ground beneath Maya's feet cracked like broken glass as she stumbled toward the emergency beacon, her fingers slick with blood from climbing out of the collapsed laboratory. Behind her, Sarah's labored breathing echoed through the pre-dawn air, each exhale a reminder that they were both running on borrowed time. The thing below had gone silent after the explosion, but Maya knew better than to trust the quiet. She'd seen enough in those underground chambers to understand that whatever the government had created down there wasn't something that could be killed by a few grenades and some collapsing concrete. It was patient, it was hungry, and it was learning. The beacon's just over that ridge, Sarah gasped, pressing a hand to her wounded shoulder. Dark stains had soaked through her makeshift bandage, and her face had taken on a waxy pallor that made Maya's stomach clench with worry. They'd been climbing for 20 minutes, following the coordinates Dr. Martinez had given them before the facility went dark. The emergency beacon was supposed to be their lifeline, a direct connection to whatever remained of the Military Oversight Committee. Maya wasn't sure she trusted them any more than she trusted the thing they left sleeping under her cabin, but right now they were the only option. A tremor rolled through the mountainside, subtle but unmistakable. Maya grabbed Sarah's arm as loose rocks skittered down the slope around them. It's moving again, Sarah whispered. Maya pressed her ear to the ground, listening. The vibrations were rhythmic, purposeful. Whatever was down there was no longer content to wait in its underground prison. The explosion had damaged more than just the laboratory walls. It had compromised the electromagnetic barriers that had kept the entity contained for decades. They crested the ridge as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of amber and gold. The emergency beacon stood 50 yards away, a stark metal tower bristling with communication equipment. Maya had never seen anything so beautiful. But as they stumbled toward it, Maya noticed something that made her blood run cold. The tower's base was surrounded by excavated earth, as if something had been digging up from below. The metal supports looked warped, twisted by some immense pressure. Sarah, look at the ground around the beacon. Sarah followed her gaze and cursed under her breath. The entire area was riddled with holes, each one perfectly circular and descending into darkness. They looked fresh. How is that possible? Sarah demanded. The facility is miles from here. Maya remembered Dr. Martinez's final words before the ceiling came down. The tunnel system is extensive. We never mapped all of it. A sound drifted up from one of the holes, a wet sliding noise that spoke of something massive moving through confined spaces. Maya's skin crawled as she realized the entity hadn't been trapped by the explosion at all. It had simply chosen a different route to the surface. We need that beacon, Maya said, checking the pistol she'd taken from the facility. 3 bullets left. Not nearly enough. They approached the communication tower like soldiers crossing a minefield, each step careful and deliberate. The holes seemed to pulse with a faint bioluminescent glow that reminded Maya of the creature's eyes. She tried not to think about what might be looking back at them from those depths. Sarah reached the control panel first, her fingers flying over the switches and dials. Static crackled through the speakers, punctuated by fragments of distant voices. Emergency frequency is live, she reported. Broadcasting our coordinates now. Maya kept watch on the holes, her weapon trained on the nearest opening. The wet sliding sounds were getting louder, accompanied by something that might have been breathing, if anything that large could be said to breathe. This ranger station, Echo 7. Requesting immediate military response, Sarah spoke into the microphone. Containment breach confirmed. Entity is mobile and heading for populated areas. Repeat, we have a containment breach. The response came immediately, tinged with static but unmistakably urgent. Echo 7. This is Colonel Henderson. We have aircraft inbound to your position. Hold your location. Maya felt a flicker of hope until she saw Sarah's expression. Maya, Sarah said quietly, pointing at the display screen. Look at the seismic readings. The monitor showed a three-dimensional map of the underground tunnel system, and Maya's hope died. The network extended for hundreds of miles in every direction, reaching towards cities and towns across 3 states. Dozens of access points pulsed red on the screen, not just holes in the ground, but caves, abandoned mines, even storm drains and subway systems. The entity hadn't been trying to escape through just one opening. It had been spreading through the entire network, sending parts of itself toward every major population center within reach. How long until the aircraft arrive? Maya asked. 20 minutes. Another tremor shook the ground, stronger this time. In the distance, Maya could see lights beginning to flicker on in the valley below as the first commuters started their day, completely unaware of what was rising to meet them. 20 minutes might be 19 minutes too late.